Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Tanya Tucker, Vice President of Alliance Engagement at America's Promise Alliance. I'm so pleased and honored to be moderating what I know will be a great conversation about the progress and challenges facing homeless students in America's public schools. With me today are our amazing panelists who will speak to their areas of expertise in research, education, and policy, as well as a rising youth advocate who was a formerly homeless youth herself. We have Erin Ingram, who is a policy advisor at Civic Enterprises and co-author of the report released earlier this year, Hidden in Plain Sight, Homeless Students in America's Public Schools. Barbara Duffield, the Director of Policy and Programs at the National Association for the Education of Homeless Children and Youth, a national membership association dedicated to educational excellence for children and youth experiencing homelessness. We also have Dr. Patricia Popp, who is the State Coordinator with Project Hope Virginia and Clinical Associate Professor in the School of Education at the College of William and Mary. Project Hope is Virginia's program for the education of homeless children and youth administered by the College of William and Mary. And we have with us Hannah Johnson, a sophomore at Virginia Commonwealth University studying elementary education. Welcome to all of you, and thanks for you being here and for all of the great work you're doing. So now I will turn it over to Erin to provide an overview of the findings from the report, Hidden in Plain Sight. Thanks, Erin.
Thanks, Tanya, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. So as she said, I'm just going to go ahead and give you an overview of the report Hidden in Plain Sight, which came out in June. And so just to give you some background, Civic Enterprises is one of the organizations, along with Johns Hopkins and America's Promise, that puts together every year the Building a Grad Nation report. And we look at high school graduation rates across our country, and we do so also specifically by looking at different groups of students and trying to understand the whole picture of how our nation is doing. So we look at low-income students, students of color, English language learners, students with disabilities, to see how well are we serving all of our students. And this past year, we watched a film called The Home Stretch that focused on homeless students in Chicago who are struggling to stay in school and to achieve their high school diploma. And at that point in time, we realized that homeless students were nowhere on our radar. And we found that both upsetting and surprising. And we thought, here's a group of students that really needs a lot of support, really needs a lot of help, and they're not being focused on and they're not being given the same kind of attention. And so we wanted to write a report that would try to understand specifically who these students are, how they're doing in our schools, and how our schools and our communities could support them better. And so for the writing of Hidden in Plain Sight, we actually went out and we talked to a lot of the students themselves. So we interviewed students who are currently in middle and high school and are homeless. And then we also surveyed 18 to 24-year-olds who were homeless at some point in time during their middle and high school years to understand what could have helped you to stay in school, to do better in school, all those kinds of questions. And then we also spoke with McKinney-Vento state coordinators and local liaisons to understand the perspectives of the adults in schools who are charged with helping these homeless students to have access to the supports that they're supposed to have and to stay in school. And so the report, the findings that we have are reflections from those different groups. So before I dive into some of the report findings, I can just give you a little bit of background too on the scope of the problem. So as you can see from this slide, in 2013-14, it was reported that there were 1.3 million homeless students in our nation's public schools. This is a really high number. And it was surprising to us to see that there were, in fact, that many. Next slide, please. So not surprisingly, the young people that we interviewed and surveyed told us that being homeless was extremely disruptive and traumatic to their everyday life. So you can see 82% said that being homeless had a big impact on them overall. And they said that included their mental health, their physical health, their social connections. All over, they said that this was very traumatic and disruptive for them. You can see, too, that academically it had a big impact. Young people told us not only was it hard to stay in school while they were homeless, but they said it was really hard to do well in school while they were homeless. So even if they were showing up and attending school, it was still hard for them to keep their GPA to really succeed and do well for themselves. And you can see that reflected too by the fact that some 42% said that they had dropped out of school at one point or more while they were homeless. Another thing that's important to point out is that this is not a one-time experience for the majority of these students. So 78% of them said that they were homeless more than once, and about 47% said that they were homeless both alone and with a family member. So this is a recurrent and cyclical pattern for them. And you can see nearly all of the students said that they slept with, or they stayed with other people rather than in one consistent place. So that might mean they were couch surfing with their friends, they were staying with relatives back and forth, but they had no one consistent place to call home and to stay at night. And then some 50% said that they slept in a place that people shouldn't be sleeping, in a car, in a park, in an abandoned building, wherever that might be. Next slide, please. So we asked the homeless students and formerly homeless students, what would have helped you to stay in school? What supports did you need? What was most important for you? And something that was very interesting was that they told us, of course, we need those tangible supports. They said transportation, they said food, they said clothing and school supplies, those are important. But equal rates, they also said that they needed those social and emotional supports. They said those were just as important. So that included having someone that they could check in with at school every day and talk to. That included being able to continue to participate in after-school programs, in arts and music programs, with sports, being able to maintain those connections with their peers as well. They said those things were just as important to them to give them a sense of stability during a time that was otherwise extremely disrupted. Next slide, please. This is something else we asked our students about. We said, when you were homeless and in school, was your school able to connect you with outside organizations that could have helped? So that included perhaps drop-in shelters, housing organizations, mentoring organizations, after-school programs, those types of things. And 61% of the students we surveyed said they were never connected by their schools to any kind of outside organization, although almost all of those who said that they were connected said that they found it extremely helpful. And so we see that as a very large gap here, where our communities and our schools can really try and pull together, because schools, as we know, while they might be a source of daily contact for students and they might be able to help in many ways, they can't do everything, and they need the support of others around them. Next slide, please. So we also spoke to the adults in schools to ask them, what is it that you need? So we asked McKinney-Vento liaisons, what are the biggest challenges that you face when you're trying to assist homeless students? And not surprisingly, the majority of them said, the biggest challenge for me is funding. There's never enough money to do the things that I want to do. They also told us that their caseloads are amazingly high. We spoke to liaisons who had hundreds of kids that were on their caseload, and that wasn't even their full-time job as to be a homeless liaison. They were perhaps also a school counselor or administrator of some type. And so they felt overwhelmed by the numbers of students that they were trying to help. But something else that they told us was that they felt that community awareness was a very big issue. They said when we talk to people, they tell us this is a problem in someone else's neighborhood, but I'm sure it doesn't happen here. It can't possibly be that there are homeless students in my neighborhood school. And they said that raising awareness around that issue could really help to try and reduce some of the stigma for these students and to try to bring more support and resources to them. Next slide, please. Great. So then I would like to kick it over to Barbara to give us a more in-depth look at some of the new regulations that are coming down and to help us understand what the future looks like for homeless students.
Thank you, Erin. What I'd like to do is just let everyone know a little bit about some very important changes that are coming fast for federal education policy for students who are experiencing homelessness. So if we could take a look at the next slide, just to give you a sense of the timing of all of this. Many people know that President Obama signed into law the Every Student Succeeds Act last year in December. What is not perhaps as well known is that that legislation contains some very specific changes for all school districts with respect to homeless students. And in fact, ESSA was the vehicle for amending the education subtitle of the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act. McKinney-Vento is the federal legislation that establishes basic rights and protections for students who are experiencing homelessness, including the requirement that school districts designate a liaison. And so ESSA amended the McKinney-Vento subtitle. Those amendments go into effect in 10 days on October 1st, 2016. And there were some very significant amendments throughout the legislation. There's been some attention paid to the fact that states will be disaggregating data for graduation rates. That provision is part of Title I, and that doesn't happen until 2017-2018. But the blueprint, the roadmap for academic success for homeless students is the McKinney-Vento Act. Those changes go into effect on October 1st with one small exception, and that is the separation of protections for homeless students and foster students. That separation of protections happens on December 10th. So just to give a broad overview, the next slide shows the major category of changes that we're looking specific to students who are experiencing homelessness. And these amendments really respond fairly directly to the hidden in plain sight findings. They very much validate the findings of the report. So just as Erin explained that many school district liaisons don't have enough time or training to devote to students who are experiencing homelessness, one of the things that ESSA does is require that both the state coordinator be able to sufficiently carry out their duties and that the local liaison be able to carry out their duties. So there's a recognition that at the school level, that designated point person really is able to carry out their duties, and that's important because there are more responsibilities under the new legislation. The legislation has a strong focus on increasing the identification because we do know that we are under-identifying students who are experiencing homelessness for a number of different reasons. So it requires specific identification and outreach efforts. It requires local liaisons to participate in professional development that the states offer, and it also requires that liaisons provide professional development to school staff on the identification, needs, and rights of students experiencing homelessness. So that's very important because if you don't know who is eligible and who meets the definition of homelessness, which is a broader definition, then those students will not receive the protections under the law. There are some important refinements in the legislation as well with respect to school stability. As we know from a lot of research and from hidden in plain sight, going from school to school really wreaks havoc with educational attainment and causes young people to fall behind quickly and even to drop out. So students who are experiencing homelessness can stay in the same school if it's in their best interest, get transportation to stay in that same school, and now those protections have been broadened to include where there is a feeder school pattern and also extended to our preschool students, which is very important because so many children who are experiencing homelessness are under the age of 6, and we know how important early childhood education is to setting the trajectory towards success later in life. There are some very important amendments around credit accrual. When young people have to go from school to school, fall behind in credits, that can become a barrier to staying in school and to graduating. So states and school districts will be required to have policies to ensure that homeless youth receive full or partial credit for coursework that they've done satisfactorily in a previous school district, which will be very important. Also, state education agencies and local education agencies need to remove barriers to enrollment and retention that may be caused by fees, fines, and absences. For example, if there's a state policy or a local policy that if you're absent for 10 days, you fail, if you're a student who's homeless, those absences are beyond your control and you're penalized essentially for your homelessness. So that's just one example of some very explicit changes in the law that will be helpful. There's also a very intentional focus on the transition to higher education. So many young people who are experiencing homelessness may not know, for example, that they can go to college or how to go about doing that. They may not know that they qualify as an independent student for federal financial aid on the FAFSA. Now, with these amendments, local liaisons are required to inform unaccompanied homeless youth in particular that of their independent student status and help them get that verification. And counselors will be required to advise and prepare homeless students so they are better ready to go to college. Also a focus on early childhood, again, the extension of school stability to preschoolers, requirements for liaisons to work with early intervention and Head Start programs, also a very important change. And as I mentioned, really a separation. Title I creates some protections for all youth in foster care that are separate from those who are from students who are homeless. So this will allow the McKinney-Vento program to focus more specifically on students who do not have a child welfare agency or any other official entity involved in their lives, while all youth in foster care receive benefits for school stability under Title I. And then very lastly, there will be a requirement for all states to report in their report cards disaggregated achievement and graduation rates for students who are experiencing homelessness. And again, this will be very critical because it sets the baseline. We'll know how we're doing. States who are already doing this can show that students who are homeless have lower graduation rates and higher dropout rates than other low-income students. So now all states will be required to report on this, and we'll have a sense of how to measure our progress in future years with respect to the academic achievement and graduation of students experiencing homelessness. So many, many changes that go into effect in 10 days. And I think on the second to the last slide, there's a link to a lot of technical assistance materials that our organization has prepared to help school districts as they move forward. And just very lastly, I'll say that a lot of these amendments were based on best practice. So for some school districts, it's not going to be a lot of work, whereas for other school districts, there's going to be some more significant attention that needs to be paid. And that is, we'll turn it over now to, I think, Dr. Patricia Popp, who is the state coordinator for Virginia.
Just 1 second. Thank you so much, Barbara. Before we get to Dr. Popp, just some key takeaways that I found in Erin and Barbara's presentations from the research, sobering numbers in terms of 60% of students surveyed said it was hard to stay in school while they were homeless, 68% hard to do well in school, 42% said they dropped out of school at least once, but certainly hope that we can combat those numbers with the new ESSA amendments that Barbara just spoke of. And so schools and states and districts required to identify, track, and reach out to those students to make sure that they drive. So hopeful that these new requirements and amendments give students the stability they need at school so they can focus on doing their best and staying on track to graduate. So thanks again to Erin and Barbara. And just a quick reminder that we'll take questions at the end of the presentation portion for the webinar. However, you can submit a question through the questions panel at any time. And so next up, we'll hear from State Coordinator Dr. Patricia Popp, who is working to train administrators and teachers on how to best support homeless students in schools. Virginia has been working for a few years now to improve conditions for homeless youth by identifying these students and providing them information about programs and caring adults who can help. So take it away, Dr. Popp.
Thank you, Tanya. And I think it was interesting how many times you just used the word hope, and that is the name of our office. So we're on the same wavelength there. For folks, some clarification, Virginia is a little unique in that our state coordinator's office is housed at a university. So this is the same position that in most states is at your state Department of Education. And that's one of those capacity pieces in the new legislation. I've already had for many years that dedicated office with full-time staff to help make these things work. So I'm kind of a lucky among my colleagues as state coordinators. In looking over the report, Hidden in Plain Sight, I was asked what were some of the results that kind of were striking to you. And really, I found much of what was in the report consistent with what we know working with our National Association scholars. And I've got Hannah sitting right here next to me, who you'll hear from in a few minutes. So a lot of what we heard, unfortunately, was consistent with what we're hearing from our students. One of the things that I really found rather disappointing, and I know we really want to work on this, is how few of those students knew about McKinney-Vento or knew that there was a liaison who should serve them. Now, there's two things going on there. Sometimes there's nobody really giving them that support, and in other cases, they were working with the liaison and getting those services. They just didn't know it was a McKinney-Vento liaison who was working with them. So this is another place where that clarification of making sure our students know their rights and understand that connection with McKinney-Vento, I think is something helpful for our students as we move into the new law. There are those challenges around these students sometimes seeming invisible and how we can do a better job with their identification. I know across Virginia there's a lot of variability. I have some wonderful liaisons who are so proactive and really trying to make sure we're reaching our students. But the fact that we have that variability in their capacity to do the job also makes the identification more inconsistent across the Commonwealth. One of the things I've been doing to try and work with that with my liaisons when I go out and I do our federal program monitoring is I bring their own poverty data to the table. And then we talk about the number and the percentage of students that they're identifying as homeless and compare that to that poverty data to begin the conversation of whether or not their numbers seem reasonable and make sense. What else we could be doing to do a better job of reaching the students. Another little interesting thing that we're looking at for this year, trying to reach some of our older youth, is looking at having more posters that are really targeted to the youth themselves, that are placed in areas where the students will see them. So something as simple as having a youth-oriented poster in a restroom. There's a thing we see, and actually I saw them at BCU when I was visiting Hannah. They're called the Stall Street Journal. And if you have something that's that private where you can pull off a number to know how to contact someone, that could be another way of reaching our students in a very non-confrontational way. I'm really excited also about the changes related to making sure counselors are connecting with our youth. And that's just another vehicle for making sure they get the message. If you'd like the next slide. Thinking about our older youth in Virginia, one of the greatest challenges, which was consistent in the report, is just that inability to find a safe place. In Virginia, we only have 3 runaway and homeless youth programs across the entire Commonwealth. So there are very limited options for our young people if they need safe housing and services and they're not with a family. Recently, I had one of my graduate assistants just check our 211 system, which is our emergency system. And if you put in just about any community in Virginia, most of the resources that we would get for our older youth were hotlines in other states. So we know we need to do a better job of finding resources and making sure then we can connect our students to them. We are doing a lot of things well. We've got challenges, but we're doing things well. I think Virginia has been really working hard at building that awareness across our communities, a lot of liaisons getting the message out, and very collaborative in their efforts with a variety of stakeholders in their communities. Because I've got some wonderful liaisons, giving them the opportunity to share their voice and making sure that other localities learn from those effective practices they have in place has been a wonderful thing that we use when we're doing trainings. I guess just to summarize some of the things in terms of what I'm looking forward to in ESSA, as Barbara mentioned a few moments ago, many of the changes are just a codification of what's been best practice, and I've been very fortunate in Virginia to have a lot of those pieces already in place. I know for us a big challenge is going to be that expansion of some of the educational stability and the challenges of making sure that we can figure out how to pay for some of those changes. My hope for some of the greatest impact with those changes, I really do think we have to remember while we're talking about older youth, this all starts with our babies and our preschoolers. If we want to make sure we have more students like Hannah when they get to that level, we need to make sure that we're taking care of their needs starting at the very youngest level. And then for thinking about our older youth as well, as I'm sitting here next to Hannah, is that emphasis on making sure our counselors are informing our youth of their rights and their connections to the higher education program. So having that for all my other Hannahs around Virginia will be something I'm looking forward to getting to know better. And
thank you, Dr. Pop.
I have one more slide. I forgot I put this one in there. All right, well,
I won't cut you off. Speak to your next slide.
This is my celebration slide. We are one of those states that's been disaggregating on-time graduation rates for our youth who are homeless since 2008. So starting with the cohort that started high school in 2004. If you look quickly at this slide, if we compare our state increase in graduation rates, Virginia overall continues to make progress, but our students who are identified as homeless in high school are actually making greater strides than our overall state average. So while we're still behind the curve, we're making gains that are closing that gap. And every year that's happened since we started to disaggregate it. So sometime in the next few weeks, I know the new data will be coming out and I'll be holding my breath again. So I do think to say we've increased it over 15%, more of our students are graduating on time since we started in 2008. Says a lot for making sure we're reaching our students and getting them connected with their services throughout their preschool through high school careers.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thank you so much, Dr. Pop. So you heard Dr. Pop reference Hannah several times in her presentation, and now it's time for us to hear from Hannah Johnson, who will reflect on her experience as a formerly homeless student and lend her personal advice to us on what more schools can do to help homeless students. So thanks so much for joining us, Hannah.
Thank you. I think one of the biggest problems we have in homeless education is identifying the students. One of my biggest challenges was that I did not know I was even homeless until probably going to my senior year. I mainly lived in motels or with relatives, and I thought that just made me a very poor student on the brink of homelessness, but not quite there. I had this idea that in order to be homeless, you had to be sleeping on a park bench or in a public space. I did not understand what the actual meaning of homeless was. When I did find out about what was going on, even though I didn't know I was homeless, I did inform my teachers because I was taking all upper level classes, and some were supportive. Some didn't really know what to do with the information. I think a lot felt uncomfortable because homelessness is such a taboo topic. No one really wants to talk about it, especially if you live in an area with reservations about people who are experiencing poverty, which was an area that I lived in. My school really did not explain any services that were available. I think mainly because where I lived, there were very few services that were available. I think there are possibly 2 affordable housing situations in the county I'm from, both of which have wait lists of over a year long. For my attendance, I had a history of missing school because of problems that stemmed from home. I missed most of 8th grade. So I technically skipped it because they just sent me on to high school. But during my junior and senior years especially, I missed school because we were constantly moving into a new motel or with a new relative, and it was expected of me as being the primary caretaker of my mother to take charge of the household and to take care of everything that was going on. There was this constant worry for me too, was that when I ran out of places in the county that I was living in, what would happen, because obviously it means I have to go outside of the school district. Because of the situation, I never learned how to drive. My family sold its car a few years previously in order to pay for a place to live. So I didn't know that transportation could be provided, and I didn't really have anyone who told me that. Many of the barriers and challenges that homeless students face, once again, stem from problems at the home. I personally had to take care of my mother. There was drug abuse problems, there was mental health problems, there was disability problems. And so I think a lot of times we forget that along with taking on the responsibilities of schoolwork and extracurriculars, a lot of homeless youth are also being the primary caretakers of their family and are kind of forced to choose which one is more important at certain times, and then penalized by the school district if it comes down to having to take care of what's going on at home. Once again, no active support from the school. I did have a lot of individuals at my school help me. Teachers who provided things like, I had one teacher whose wife took me to a college visit. I had another one who worked with the librarians in order for me to have a laptop where I could do my schoolwork at home. But from an administrative level, I dealt with a lot of bureaucracy that I really should not have to deal with. At one point, I was almost not allowed to walk at my high school graduation, despite having almost a 4.0, despite having extracurriculars, despite winning a medal at my high school graduation, simply because I could not afford to pay a $40 due that all seniors had to pay. When it comes to the liaisons, I was unaware that there were any such thing as a homeless liaison until I had to get a document signed for my college in order to get financial aid. I found the NACI scholarship online rather than from my school, which was a blessing. My guidance office paid for all of my AP and IB tests, which was also a blessing, and I was able to get those credits and, help me out my post-high school career. If I had to give any advice to anyone who's listening right now, I think the most important thing, rather than transportation or shelter or food, other than those things, they're all very important, but I think the best thing that you can do for a homeless student, no matter what level they are, is to be a mentor to them, to tell them that they can do what they want to do, that they are not going to be held back by how much money that their family brings in, or that they tell them that they're not going to be the statistic like they've been told all their life. I have a mentor in high school who continues to be my mentor now, who helps me find resources when I need them, who kicks me in the butt whenever I need to do something, and just honestly it's the closest thing to a parent figure I've ever had, and the closest thing to normalcy I've had my entire life. And I cannot stress enough just how important having that mentor is. Even if you don't see it from the student, it's truly spectacular.
Hannah, thank you so much. We so appreciate you sharing your experiences, giving advice to all of us. And thanks again to all of you for joining us today. It was great hearing your insights on what is and will certainly continue to be an important issue for America's public schools. At this time, I'd also like to thank our sponsor, Seattle-based Raikes Foundation, which just launched a new partnership with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to better support and find stability for the 35,000 homeless students in Washington so that they can succeed. Along with the Paul G. Allen and Campion Foundation, together they plan to commit $1.86 million to this effort known as Schoolhouse Washington. We are grateful for your support and work in this area. So now we'll move into the Q&A portion of the webinar. And so if you haven't already, we encourage you to submit questions, and we've got several here. So I'm going to start, I'm going to put two questions together. So one question was, what is the definition of homelessness? And I'll follow that up with, why has the number of homeless students been rising? So what's the definition of homelessness, and why has the number of homeless students been rising?
This is Erin. I can get started on that question, then I can let Barbara jump in to give the most accurate and correct description of the definition of homelessness. But in this report, when we ask students, we use the Department of Education's definition of homelessness, which is different than the Department of the Housing and Urban Development Department. So for McKinney-Vento, it's a student who lacks a fixed nighttime residence, and so that includes kids who are couch surfing, kids who are in motels, people sleeping in cars, those who are doubled up with relatives, and it makes sense to do this particularly for education because, you're talking about students who are experiencing a great deal of instability. Even if they have a roof over their head, that doesn't mean that they're sleeping in the same place every night. It doesn't mean that it's going to be just as easy for them to get to school today as it will be tomorrow, as it was yesterday. And so having those supports available to students is really essential, and that's part of the reason that this definition makes sense for educators. And I can let Barbara add to that if she would like.
Yeah, thank you. And I think, as Hannah said, if you're not aware of what that definition is, then for our educators, that it's very difficult to do the identification. And for students, it's very hard to self-identify. The category of staying with other people temporarily because there's nowhere else to go, which in the law is sharing housing with others due to economic hardship, loss of housing, or a similar reason, 75% of the students identified by public schools for our most recent school year data are in that category. And as Dr. Pop mentioned, when there's only 3 shelters for youth in the entire state, there's nowhere else to go. Shelters are full. They don't. If they do exist, they're full. They turn people away. They have rules. And the motels and staying temporarily with other people are can not only be precarious in terms of the instability, but they can also be not safe situations. So I think it is important for anyone working in public education, early childhood, higher education. It's the same definition. It's the McKinney-Vento definition of homelessness, and it's a critical piece to understand in terms of making any of this work on the ground.
Great, thanks, Barbara. And then to address the second part of the question, in terms of why we've seen high numbers of homeless students, we do think in part that it's because schools are getting better at identifying students. So as Hannah mentioned, many students are never identified, perhaps because they wouldn't say themselves that they are homeless, or because schools are just not as good at identifying them. As Barbara mentioned, it can be difficult. And then because students are not telling people, then they're not counted, and so that could be part of the reason that perhaps schools are getting better at just identifying who those students are and reporting them. But then we also do think that it is in part due to a lot of the economic instability that we've seen over the last decade. So the Great Recession in 2008 really destabilized a lot of families. It pushed people out of their jobs, people lost their homes, and to a great extent, a lot of those families have never recovered and they've never regained that stability. And so we do think that that's part of the reason as well.
Thanks, Erin. Thanks, Barbara. Barbara, I've got a question for you. What is the benefit of separating homelessness and foster care provisions?
Sure. Well, students who are experiencing homelessness and those who are in foster care, there are many similarities in terms of the mobility, the trauma, the barriers that they face. But the big difference is that students in foster care are in the custody of an agency that has funding and legal responsibility for their care and well-being. Students who are homeless do not have such an agency. No one plans where they stay. Their basic needs are not met. There's no similar entity. They may not even have shelter. So allowing McKinney-Vento to focus exclusively on those students ensures greater attention there. And at the same time, the protections for all students in foster care in Title I is done in collaboration with the Child Welfare Agency. So those Title I protections for all students in foster care envision a dual role, a shared responsibility between child welfare and schools, which is appropriate, again, because there is a big difference in terms of the presence of a legal agency that has specific funding and many adults who are involved. So again, it's important for both populations, for students who are in foster care to have the agencies working together, and it's important for students who are experiencing homelessness that the only adults who may be focusing in on their needs are those at school, and that they be able to be focused in and have the time and capacity to do that.
Thanks, Barbara. Dr. Pop, a question for you. So through your work in Virginia, what's an example of an effective local strategy that you've seen and tried to share statewide?
So in terms of, well, one of them is that the posters that we just talked about for older youth that some of my liaisons have recently shared with me, and it came up with yes, it was with all my liaisons. Different ones have been sharing a similar process. Another is we have some of our larger school divisions which have a greater number of school social workers. They are all trained in working with the schools that they work with to make sure that they're identifying these students. So where you've got that cadre of school social workers, they've been wonderful, especially in making connections with our unaccompanied youth. So those would be two to get you started.
Great, thanks. And Hannah, a question for you. Someone wants to know, how did you find your mentor?
My mentor was actually a teacher that I had starting in my junior year. He taught me 2 classes, so he saw me every day. And one of the classes was a 2-year course, so the next year I saw him every single day. And he was the teacher who responded the most to what I was going through and wanted to provide anything that he could in order to make sure that I could be successful in the classroom.
Thanks, Hannah. So the next question is, should liaisons continue identifying students awaiting foster care as homeless through December 10th. So Barbara, I don't know if that's a question you could answer.
Yeah, and the answer is yes. I mean, the awaiting foster care placement phrase is in the McKinney-Vento Act until December 10th, 2016. So that, standard operating procedures until December 10th, 2016. After that, if they were identified as McKinney-Vento, they maintain those protections till the end of the school year. But starting December 11th, that is when any new student who is at any stage of proceeding in foster care would be covered under the Title I protections. And, every state is coming up with their plan and doing things right now. So it's important to check with the state. But again, it's standard operating procedures until December 10th, and then things switch over on December 11th.
Great, and probably sticking with you again, Barbara, for this question, does the feeder school, preschool, and credit accrual take effect October 1st, 2016 as well?
Yes, everything in the McKinney-Vento Act, those amendments that I covered, all of it goes into effect. It goes into place on October 1st. The only exception is the foster care piece.
Next question, are the district liaisons going to be organized into any type of national network so that they can share best practices, such as around school community partnerships?
Actually, that is our association, the National Association for the Education of Homeless Children and Youth. The vast majority of our membership are the school district liaisons, and we have a conference coming up at the end of October in Orlando. There are many, we have a housing track. We are highlighting many, many bright spots in terms of those school housing partnerships, both for families and for unaccompanied homeless youth. So that is, and I think, if anyone's interested, to go on the website, even if you can't come to the conference in Orlando, just to download those concurrent session descriptions and see all the amazing work that's happening from McKinney-Vento liaisons and their community partners across the country.
Thanks, Barbara. Next question, how do school systems determine who is responsible for the role of homeless liaison? Should it be an attendance officer, a school social worker, supervisor? Any advice or guidance there?
This is Pat. I'm happy to take that one for you. It varies so much based upon the size of the school district and the resources they have available. I can easily say that a school social worker is one of the best matches in terms of skill sets and training with the responsibilities a liaison has. In some very small school districts, it may be that the Title I person is also the homeless liaison. It's not uncommon that it's also the homeless liaison is the attendance officer. Obviously, attendance is one of those risk factors, and as you look at that attendance, it's one of the ways of identifying a student who may be homeless. So it really has to be somewhat unique to the community.
Yeah, and if I could jump in and just add to that, so the role, of course, varies across school district, as Dr. Pop is saying, and something that we heard from the liaisons and coordinators that we talked to was that while the role itself might be designated to one person, it would be really helpful for them to have people trained at all levels in the school so that everyone has the same knowledge and understanding of how a student is identified as homeless and then what the supports are that they're entitled to have and what that looks like in their own school. So if it's everyone from the administrators all the way down to the teachers, down to the people serving lunch in the cafeteria, they said the more adults in school who are aware and who know what they should be able to do, the better, and the more easily we'll be able to quickly identify these students.
I agree completely, Erin, and actually that's one of the nice pieces of a change in ESSA is that our liaisons must provide professional development within their school districts. So it's another way to make sure that happens.
Thank you all. And Hannah, here's a question for you. What were some of the most and least helpful things adults did while you were in school and homeless? For example, what should adults do and not do when it comes to homeless students in their schools?
I think one of the most helpful things that teachers did or people in the school system did was they acknowledged it and they accepted it and they treated me just as they did before they found out. constantly throughout my high school career. When I walked into certain areas of my school, I felt like I had a target on my back because of the political climate, and I felt unwelcome and like I did not belong there. Just being accepting of the person. The worst thing I think ever happened was probably, like I said, it was not accepting the student. It was having teachers telling me that they weren't going to let me walk the stage during graduation because I could not pay $40, who told me to go have my boyfriend pay it or that I could pay in installments. And that was just, they didn't know I was homeless. All they knew was I was a poor student. So I would say being very respectful of what the student's going through, and if you can find any resource that might help them, of course, bring it to their attention. And if they want to take it, I'm sure they will.
Thanks, Hannah. Very helpful. So following up on what adults should and shouldn't do, we have a question about how do you help other students understand and have compassion for homeless students?
I think that's a bit more difficult because I feel like the students learn from what they've been taught their entire life. I think it was really refreshing for some of my peers who did eventually find out what exactly is going on in the community, because a lot of times we are hidden, and everyone was very shocked when they did find out. I don't know how much you can do for some who are more stubborn and just want to say, well, you're the exception to what my personal belief is. I still have friends who I keep in contact with that still believe that I'm just the exception and that there is not a larger issue going on. So I think just allowing students to see that we are normal people. We're not all of us are sleeping on the street. We're not doing drugs or purposely trying to harm ourselves in any way, and we have the same goals that they do.
Great, thank you. So there are, again, sort of two questions that I'm going to couple together. So one is about resources. The specific question is, what are resources in Ohio related to this issue of homeless students? So if anybody wants to and can speak to Ohio specifically, but then I think generally, where do we point folks to get more information, resources in their states around this issue?
I can help a little bit, and then Pat, maybe you can jump in as well. I think that every state is required to have a state coordinator for the education of homeless children and youth, the counterpart to Dr. Pop in other states. So I would recommend certainly contacting the state coordinator in Ohio, Susanna Wayland, is a good place to start for finding out, for example, where the liaisons are. Some of the Ohio school districts, I don't know where the questioner is from, but for example, in Cleveland and in Akron and Canton and Cincinnati have very strong community partnerships. So for example, in Cincinnati, they work with Project Upstart, and it's a nonprofit that sort of partners to fill the needs that the school district McKinney-Vento program can't fill. So you've got a state level contact, and then you've got your local liaisons. I think it's also important for everyone to know that even if the district doesn't have funding through McKinney-Vento, very few school districts do because the funding is so low, all school districts are required to set aside some Title I funds for homeless students. So there has to be a liaison and there has to be a Title I set aside, and that's another source of resources for school districts. And some of the partner organizations in many communities, United Way, the civic organizations like the Rotary or Kiwanis are good partners for the school district as well. So those are just some places. And again, I think Dr. Papa, I'd like to turn it over to you and see if you have some additional suggestions.
Hi, Barbara, I was thinking the Cincinnati program too is a great example of some wonderful things going on. Just a reminder, with our ESSA, there's now a requirement that those liaisons in all the school districts be posted on the state's homeless ed page. So if you're not sure where your liaison is, that information should be shortly available if it's not already.
Thank you. So kind of keeping with the resources issue, there's a question around what are the top challenges in aligning community organizations that are focused on the same mission to positively affect graduation rates. So how do you sort of partner and collaborate with what's going on in the schools and kind of the larger community organizations working with young people?
Well, I'll just start, but I think, again, that making the connection with the liaison, I mean, not every school district is going to have somebody who's full-time, who's dedicated to this, but many of them will have somebody. And so that relationship between the liaison and community-based organizations is the first place to start. I know, Erin, you were out in Oregon earlier, and we're on a panel of organizations that were connecting the work to reduce the dropout rate with homeless liaisons. And I think sometimes community partners may not know who to start with, may not know that there's somebody there, and again, may not even know the prevalence of homelessness because they're not aware of the definition in the school district's role.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would say perhaps, like you said, a good place to start would be identifying who the liaison is in your area, and then also we really encourage too, just because we know that this issue is so invisible in many cases, for organizations to think and look more carefully and consider if you're already serving homeless students in some way. And if you're not, if there's a particular niche that you might be really well suited. So particularly we've been talking about, mentoring organizations. As Hannah said, that was something that was so valuable for her. Is there a way for the mentoring organizations to specifically try and work with schools and see, can we provide mentors for these students? So things like that, trying to forge those connections and come to the schools and try to be community partners.
Thanks, Erin. And you talked about mentors in your last response. So we have a couple of questions here where folks are wondering if, they're just getting started and they want to mentor homeless students or find volunteer opportunities in their community around this issue. Where do they start?
I mean, you could perhaps start with just your local mentoring organizations themselves. You can look at groups like Big Brothers Big Sisters, Boys and Girls Clubs. After school programs might be a really great place to try and get involved, since we know that homeless students are particularly in need of safe spaces that are quiet and calm for them to do their work after school or before school. Trying to think, to yourselves, who are those organizations already serving large numbers of kids that I can reach out to and offer to work as a mentor.
Thank you. A question around how do you balance the awareness for the homeless student and the family and what they're going through with confidentiality?
Well, I'm actually at a training in Arizona today, and yesterday we trained all of the liaisons around this issue, and that question came up about, for example, when does somebody find out? How, for example, teachers and again, Pat, jump in here too, but it's really kind of on a need-to-know basis. I mean, we have to raise awareness generally. Liaisons and school districts are required to proactively identify students, to disseminate notice, for example, where in locations where students are. That's actually where families and youth are. That's actually a legal requirement. But in terms of the confidentiality piece, it's really on a need-to-know basis. There doesn't, if there's no reason to know, then there's no reason to necessarily say. But at the same time, we don't want, for example, students penalized because they didn't have internet access, or they were awake all night trying to protect siblings, and so they're falling asleep in class, and the teacher maybe just thinks that they're blowing the class off. So there is that delicate balance around the need to know to protect privacy, but also making sure that if there is a need to know, it's shared in a way that is respectful and involves the students and the parents.
I would agree with making sure that we're involving the student and parents in what information is shared and how it is shared. I'm especially thinking about sharing that with teachers. I think it's important for teachers to have some understanding of what our students are experiencing, making sure they understand that confidentiality issues around the information that they receive, and that they have the training and understanding in order to serve the students appropriately with that information. So our teachers need to have a good understanding of how do you work with a student who's experiencing homelessness. And I'd say this is true for even mentors, that we need to really build that information about trauma-informed care and making sure that we're connecting with our students appropriately.
Thank you so much. We are getting close to the end of our time, but I want to make sure there was a question, Barbara, for you to repeat information about your association and the conference you mentioned in Orlando. If you could repeat that information for folks again.
Sure. Again, we have a very long acronym. We're the National Association for the Education of Homeless Children and Youth. There is a link, I think, to our website on one of the concluding slides. If you go under the conference tab, you'll see that I think the Saturday, October the 29th is the pre-conference, and then the full conference is October 30th to November 1st. We have over 90 sessions this year. We expect well over 1,000 people. And again, even if it's a conference you can't attend, I would recommend checking out the concurrent sessions because they are educational in and of themselves, and they're also very inspirational too.
Thanks, Barbara. Thanks, everyone, for the great questions. We're at our time for the webinar. I will say that you all were sharing some wonderful resources and links as the discussion was going on, and I encourage you all to share those through social media and on Twitter and use the hashtag #UnseenStudents, and that way we can all be part of the conversation and get the wonderful resources that you've identified. So thanks again for joining us today. I encourage you to learn more and download the full report, Hidden in Plain Sight, which is available on gradnation.org. And again, join the conversation on social media by using the hashtags #UnseenStudents and GradNation to add your very important voice. Thanks again for joining us. Everyone, please have a great afternoon. Thanks again.